very happy as our last speaker for this year's series to have Mai'a Davis Cross. She's the Edward Brooke Professor of Political Science, International Affairs at Northeastern University. She works on international cooperation, especially European foreign and security policy, epistemic communities, crises, diplomacy, and public diplomacy. She's written or edited 5 books. The 2 most recent are European-Russian Power Relations in Turbulent Times, published by Michigan University Press in 2021, and The Politics of Crisis in Europe, published by Cambridge in 2017. She definitely has a book on diplomats and also on epistemic communities in the security field in Europe, which are the work I know best myself. And our discussant will be Ana Juncos. She's a member of the standing group on the EU steering committee. She's professor of European politics at Bristol University. Her own research focuses on EU foreign and security policy, particularly conflict prevention, peace building, and resilience. She's written a number of books, including EU foreign and security policy in Bosnia from Manchester in 2013, and co-edited EU conflict prevention and crisis management from Routledge in 2011. And like Thomas Christiansen, who's with us, she's an editor at the Journal of European Integration. So Mai'a, the Zoom screen is yours. We expect you to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe 40, and then we'll have maybe 10 minutes of commentary from Ana, and then we will have open discussion. So Mai'a.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to ECPR and the speaker series, and of course you as Jonathan and Ana for organizing this. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to present what really truly is a work in progress. So, you know, I kind of went on an intellectual journey to get to this particular book project. The larger project has the working title International Cooperation in an Ultrasocial World. It's under contract with Oxford University Press. It's a much broader book than my previous work. I have been, you know, in most of my research, very closely focused, almost at a micro level, on EU processes of integration, particularly in the security realm, involving epistemic communities, crises, public diplomacy, and so on. But as I kind of worked through these various projects, it sparked an interest for me in stepping back and kind of trying to understand and examine what I was seeing more broadly in terms of EU cooperation and the nature of international relations and how it impacts the EU. Is the EU unique, or is it part of general patterns in international relations? Of course, it is unique in many, many ways, but in a broader way, I think it might not be so unique. There are some other examples of ways in which humans have come together to cooperate in unexpected ways that really deserve explanation. So it's a good point in time for me to receive any feedback that any of you might have. The main point is this approach that I'm calling ultrasociality. And the book actually does have 4 major case studies, one of which is EU integration. So today I'm going to spend a little more time than I normally would kind of laying out my framework of analysis, just because that is the area where it's challenging and new. And then I'm going to kind of zero in on the EU integration case. So the main point that I'd like to make in the book is that we as humans are a fundamentally social, empathic, other regarding species. And my starting point is, again, this notion of ultrasociality, which is borrowed from anthropology. it builds on a significant and emerging literature from other fields that are in agreement on this point about human nature. So I'm going to highlight some of the findings, not all, but just some of the major findings from this literature that kind of support this argument. The notion that we are a fundamentally empathic species may seem excessively optimistic, maybe shockingly naive, especially in our world today. But I think some of this is because there's been a strong focus on the negative, both in the IR literature and in the media. Bad news sells. We tend to focus on the crises of the moment. And there's a lot out there, right? The rise of nationalism in some countries, the slide away from democracy. It would be easy to sort of say, what is she talking about? Ultrasociality is simply wrong if we look at the outcomes. But I would actually argue that in light of the role of the media and really the role of the field of international relations itself, our theories are filtering into the popular discourse, and they're disproportionately focused on negative developments. So we're not focused enough, I think, on identifying positive things, the sort of similarities across humankind, the capacity for cooperation. So I think what we're seeing, what we can really distill from these other disciplines is that we as people have much more in common than that which separates us. And so this book is, of course, in starting this way, positioned against the mainstream and dominant assumptions of international relations. And I can say this particularly sitting here in Boston in the United States, that, realism is still the dominant argument, as is rationalism as an ontology. And there are assumptions there that by default, we as humans are selfish, power maximizing, insecure, trust is difficult to find, common solutions are difficult to find. And so even arguments, there's of course a big literature, liberalism, constructivism, that argue against this are kind of forced to grapple with that argument of selfishness and power maximization as sort of the default. So there is, of course, a caveat here, because I'm well aware that it's quite dangerous. At minimum, it's risky to bring in biology into the social sciences and humanities. And at the same time, I think there are productive ways to do so, because particularly now looking at the wide disjuncture between the findings in these other sciences, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, cognitive psych, and others, and my own field of international relations. So I think it is actually necessary to try to grapple with it without, of course, being deterministic of human behavior. So there's nothing inevitable about outcomes in our political world. I'm not arguing that. There are instead certain predispositions, I think, that are so strongly present in our species through evolution that I would argue it's necessary to consider what role they play in IR. And I think without taking into account these discoveries, we might continue on this path, which is the dominant approach of starting with faulty assumptions. So in the presentation, I'm now going to kind of go over quite quickly just kind of like highlights of this interdisciplinary literature, explain my own argument, and then zero in on the EU case and then conclude. So for this interdisciplinary literature, I find the underpinnings of ultrasociality, which can be boiled down to this idea that we are pre-wired, hardwired, and soft-wired to be empathic, cooperative, and socially oriented. And this is coming from a range of disciplines, the brain, cognition, at the smallest level, genetics. But the manuscript is kind of organized, starting small and building until we get to the social sciences. So again, just because we are, I think, innately equipped to cooperate as social beings, it doesn't mean we automatically cooperate, especially internationally. And it also doesn't mean that all forms of cooperation are actually ultrasocial. So those are things to keep in mind here. But, in some ways, I'm tapping into one of the oldest debates we've had as humans. Are humans naturally predisposed to be social, empathic, and cooperative? Or are we actually selfish, violent, and materialist? And so here I just kind of list the old philosophers who've been having this debate for centuries. However, of course, they did not have the technology and science to start to answer some of these questions more concretely. It's really only in the last couple of decades that new technologies like MRIs, big data, other scientific discoveries that map the brain and do so in real time have started to kind of answer these questions. So in particular, the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, machine invented in the 90s can see neural activity in the brain in reaction to experiments and can observe the brain in real time. So in 1996, mirror neurons were discovered, this idea that, the brain kind of automatically reacts with empathy in watching, for example, someone else getting hurt. So this has prompted a number of studies, and I'm highlighting one here in particular that kind of initially sparked my interest in this research. Jeremy Rifkin really summarizes these new findings. Recent discoveries in brain science and child development are really forcing a rethink of long-held beliefs about aggression, materialism, utilitarianism, and so on. And this is empathy is more than sympathy. Sympathy is more passive. Empathy conjures up active engagement, he argues. So this is where we're soft-wired to be social and empathic. And it's not like political science has fully ignored all of these findings. IR has been more kind of in that vein, but Rose McDermott, who is a political science, did collaborate with someone in biopolitics and pointed this out, that, because political science is sort of ignoring these other findings, just about every other discipline except political science has been exploring the importance of biological markers. I actually don't agree with their take on this, because they're more at the individual level, and I think that starts to get a little close to determinism biologically, whereas I sort of like to think of this more as a macro predisposition sort of on the planet, as opposed to kind of, your genes cause you to vote conservative or liberal. Steven Pinker also kind of begins to add to this literature from a more cognitive psych approach. This, I think, is more convincing than micro-level sort of human inclinations, but really talking about the decline in violence over millennia. He doesn't go so far as to actually kind of explain it in international relations terms, but he does really point out this kind of growth in altruism, cooperation, empathy. This book, Social, is, from the social neuroscience perspective, is in some ways perhaps most convincing in talking about these latest discoveries. Our brains are hardwired to be social. So essentially they find that when we are doing nothing, our brains actually work socially. It's our default mode. So they have a number of really interesting findings, one of which is that when we experience social pain, which is like being excluded from a group, for example, the same part of the brain activates as when we experience physical pain. So in effect, he ultimately concludes that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is reversed, that we actually prioritize social needs ahead of like even food and water. And a number of experiments have kind of looked into that. So discoveries about the social nature of the brain only in the last few decades have started to kind of question basic things, even about like education of children and how that works. The most recent finding along these lines is from evolutionary sociology, Nicholas Christakis, and he talks about this kind of pre-wiring through evolution to cooperate. We have a common humanity alongside individual differences, he finds, and this is from a deep evolutionary heritage. So things like freedom of assembly, group-oriented collaboration, how we learn and teach socially as a species. Anthropologists in general have identified a long list of so-called human universals, qualities that are shared by all humans across the globe. Evolutionary biology, talking about cooperation even among strangers, even altruistically. Human evolution talks about this. Again, it's all around us. Even without coercion from the state, people voluntarily cooperate. In sociobiology, and I know E.O. Wilson's a little bit controversial, but some of these findings are shared across the field. The sacrifices people make, even for strangers, in order to kind of benefit the common good. The field of ecology also has similar findings. Anthropology and environmental science looking at even how competitive social environments lead to the spread of pro-social behavior, cultural adaptation really favors cooperation and empathy. Some recent findings, even in looking at crowd psychology, show that, even being in cities, being in a crowd kind of sparks in people a health advantage from the social forces in cities. Those pictures of the Indian festival have shown this surprising finding that even though the water that they kind of commute to for this festival is incredibly polluted, the health that they maintain is higher than you would expect. And the argument is that because it is such a social interaction, people in some ways are protected from exposure to that. This is kind of my last slide along this line that sort of points to, while, at the same time, there is this kind of evolutionary leap to ultrasociality, there is also a dark side to human cooperation. So we do need to acknowledge that. And the book manuscript kind of addresses this argument about tribalism. Of course, there's nationalism, ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, all kinds of horrible things that humans have done. And there are arguments here as well that explain this, that actually it is taking advantage of the ultrasociality that people have psychologically, that malevolent leaders are able to kind of exploit that in their hunger for power and to weaponize that. So while people initially feel as though they're being brought into a community, they actually are brought into something that's us versus them. And so this is exploited, and this is part of the explanation for why you get essentially anti-sociality. So then the challenge is, how do you bridge this into international relations? How do you scale it up? And this is a very big challenge. So I think that I'm essentially putting forward, one way to bridge it. I think there could be other ways to bridge it, but this is what I think sort of works. Effectively, the first step is to recognize that ultrasociality works as a kind of ontology for us in political science or international relations. It means that we understand our social reality to be one based on our species' evolutionary predisposition to be other regarding, empathic, cooperative, and altruistic. So this is, again, in total contrast to the dominant ontology in international relations. And it also helps those of us who don't buy into that have a different starting point that's justified. So ultrasociality, I think, creates a kind of landscape of ideas. It effectively works as a structure, and it sets certain parameters for the types of ideas that are more likely to flourish in international relations. So my second step is to then put forward a theory of ideas that builds on ultrasociality as an ontology. And that is that ideas that enable this kind of behavior, that transform our institutions to achieve ultrasociality, are more likely to be accepted and championed, whereas those that constrain or go against those inclinations are less likely to be accepted. That it's a very broad level kind of summary of what I write more deeply in the manuscript itself, because I do argue that this landscape of ultrasociality is not uniform. There are times in which human society is more drawn towards it, and in other times when it's not. And so I think this is one way we could build the theory. And so from there, I then kind of think about how can I have this theory of looking at international relations based on this new starting point. And I think there is a justification on a general level to focus more on society and social movements as possibly the origins of major ideas. This would be prior to when a lot of scholars look at when changes in international relations occur. They tend to look at states or state leaders. But instead, if we go earlier and look at the role of society in spurring transformational change, that might help understand where we get to when it comes to what states do. Other ideas that are more gradual or transactional, I think, kick in later, but the big transformational moments, I think, are likely to be found at the societal level. And this is when you get the kind of facilitation of the emergence of leaders that champion those ideas. So in the study with the cases that I'm addressing in the book manuscript, there's a kind of general pattern through to get to these cooperative breakthroughs. An idea emerges, a social movement supports it, policy change leaders emerge because leaders need followers. The idea then gains wider legitimacy with the help of those leaders. The power of possibility, the spark to the imagination, the potential for transformation grows, and society coalesces around that idea. So in international relations, there is a literature on ideas. It's relatively small compared to other approaches. But why certain ideas win over others? Which ideas matter? These are some of the key questions. And most of that literature tends to be focused more on smaller or middle level ideas, such as causal beliefs or policy change. And here I'm trying to tackle something that I don't think has really been examined, which is worldview level changes in ideas. So we could look at, what types of leaders promote what types of ideas, which is kind of what exists currently in the literature. But I think this neglects the prior step. What explains the emergence of that leader in the first place, and why that idea and not another idea? So I think building from that, certain ideas are more likely to succeed. First, those with transcendent impact, which are by definition aspirational. They usually look like they're not possible in the moment, and yet that is what sort of attracts followers. Second, a sense of optimism. And this also kind of builds on the interdisciplinary literature as well. It's not just kind of theorizing about it in IR, but during times of societal optimism, often in the wake of an existential crisis, we can observe a landslide of ideational acceptance and transformation. Whether it's, landing on the moon, saving the planet, or even looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now, and the way in which states, especially liberal states, have come together in a way that we would have said was impossible before. So general pessimism in human society leads to a more cynical transactional view. But crises can often spark more optimism. And then finally, I look for kind of a new narrative or myth, the story behind why there would be change. So the origin story behind the EU, for example, is that in order to put a stop to wars driven by nationalism, European nation states needed to voluntarily pull their sovereignty in a new supranational order. This is kind of the narrative that emerged, and new leaders came out of that. So just a snapshot of the 4 cases of the book, and then I'm just going to zero in on European integration in sort of the last 10 minutes. But I selected these cases really not because they're the easiest examples, but because they were highly unlikely cases at the beginning. They were highly unlikely to really result in cooperation, given what we had seen so far before. But each of the cases shows how strong ultra-social ideas emerge in the wake of major crises, sparking this widespread societal level movement, shaping debates then at the elite political level. So I'm starting much earlier, and it's based on archival research, participant observation, and interviews of cooperation leaders. So zeroing in on the European integration case, I mean, this audience in particular, I think, you're far more knowledgeable about the story of European integration than most international relations scholars are. So the standard story, of course, does often look at the origins of the European project in the 1950s. It often assumes that it's elite-led. Some have argued that it really was balance of power after World War II that enabled it. Some argue it was driven by the need to recover economically. Others focus on institutions. So a typical approach kind of says, at a basic history of the EU, the coal and steel community was a brief and disappointing precursor to the European community. Now let's move to the treaties of Rome. The broader international literature essentially assumes that this is just a trading bloc with little social loyalty to it. So acknowledging the importance of ultrasociality, I think, calls for an understanding of the significance of the ultrasocial drives within European society at the time, the centrality of the ultrasocial landscape of ideas in Europe after World War II. And it requires going further back in time a bit. So I argue essentially that without the strength of the societal level European movement, which rallied around the federalist idea, the influence of leaders like Jean Monnet, Spinelli, Coudenhove, Kalergi, Schumann, and others would not have taken hold. So this is very clearly a tale over the decades of time of the gradual achievement of federalism, not the failure of it, I would argue. The idea has at times been stronger and weaker, but nonetheless it has moved in the direction of more. So we can trace the idea even further back to the 17th century. But sticking with the wake of World War II, it was very popular on both sides of the Atlantic to talk about European federalism, but also a wider world or regional federalism. By 1947, support for this, some kind of world, regional, European federalism, was so high. It was directly equated with the path to peace. It was commonplace to talk about it. And as Thomas Weiss wrote recently, looking back at this time, throughout the 1940s, it was impossible in the US to read periodicals, listen to the radio, watch newsreels, and not encounter the idea of world government. So I think this was the larger idea out of which European federalism grew, and the transatlantic dimension was important. So the high-level societal support ultimately manifested in an elite kind of speech, which I think you would all be familiar with, which is the Churchill, United States of Europe. The first time a leader actually came out and said something like this so blatantly. But the European movement was a societal level movement coming from the people across Europe, not just the original 6 countries, to achieve federalism in Europe. The key leaders were highly politically prominent and had close ties to governments, but they were trying to kind of react to the societal push and bring a number of federalist organizations under one umbrella. So it was a non-official organization with an international council of around 120 representatives. One important dimension of it was the role of the young people, a major force behind it, regularly proclaiming their militant support for a united Europe. Many organizations pre-existed this movement, such as Pan-European Union and this Atlantic organization, which sought to make NATO actually something like the EU today, political, economic, cultural, social, a union of Atlantic nations. And in light of Brexit, it's important to note here, I think, too, that the British were no exception to this pro-federal thinking. They were actually quite strongly involved in the discourse across all political parties of the need for a federal union. In just 1 year, they acquired 12,000 members, 225 branches, and it grew from there. I'm not going to read this entire quote, but it gives you a bit of a flavor of how this then moves from a movement to the key central debate of what to do, which was in the Council of Europe. So reflecting back on this, Harold Macmillan talked about how, this was a spontaneous surge of emotion. It was coming from the people, purely unofficial, voluntary, comprised of regular leaders, men and women of many countries. And he explicitly says, this was not from governments. We had to almost force the governments to kind of pay attention. U.S. encouragement was also key. And again, even in the U.S., this was at the societal level. The American Committee for a United Europe, the Ford Foundation, this group led by William Donovan, writing letters to the White House to convince the U.S. government to support this, and writing letters across the Atlantic to each other. It was really actually interesting reading some of these letters. So the U.S. groups hoped to form a broader federalism with Europeans, but if not, they wanted to really encourage federalism in Europe, and Congress actually considered this. Kennedy, Gerald Ford debated this, saying the UN should be turned into a world federation. And altogether, the push was quite big across the Atlantic on both sides. The Council of Europe debate itself started out strong, talking about, matter of life and death, clearly, transcendent ideas and ideas that clearly reflected ultrasociality, the draw of it, the desire to be in a kind of cooperative arrangement. talking about representatives of Europe trying to consider and solve problems in the interest of Europe as a whole, not in a kind of national type of debate. So obviously the Council of Europe is not where EU integration is. So this kind of quickly fizzled out and things moved forward with the more limited coal and steel community. But I think the ultrasocial lens now provides the context and underlying meaning of what happened after that. Something that may look small and incremental on the surface could actually be the first steps in the drives towards transcendent impact, and that is what carried the idea forward. So Jean Monnet makes clear, that all of this is not born of fear, as many realists would argue, but actually about establishing a Western world for all that would reflect common humanity. He eventually steps down from leadership of the coal and steel community, but again, through one of these federalist organizations, he pushes through his action committee for more. Common foreign policy and defense were a significant part of his goals, and this was really like a 2-decade effort on his part. So just to kind of zoom out at how I sort of categorize things, the periods as more transformational versus transactional, you see here on the chart the basic rundown, which 70s and 80s, this time of Euro pessimism, progress slows, and you see the federal idea being less discussed. It's discussed still, but outside of the public spotlight. At other times during the 80s through the 2000s, you have more transformation, and the ultrasocial lens points us towards the importance of the enduring ideas which bolstered the strong new narrative during these periods. And importantly, it's not the speed of integration does coincide with the rise and fall of the popularity of the federalist idea. It does not directly coincide with increased economic gain, as neoliberals might assume. So that's, I think, an important thing that sort of points to the power of the idea. And a number of key informal pro-federalist groups are incredibly influential: the Crocodile Club, Conference on European Federation, Spinelli Group, and so on. From the 80s to 2005, a transformation returns, a period of rapid enlargement, and the enlargement process itself shows, this magnetism of the European project and the transformational idea of federalism. Membership requires more than conforming to economic standards, of course, and this is where you see the kind of ideational pull. There's a desirable dimension of being part of such a common ultrasocial project. Then in the 90s, you finally get the Maastricht Treaty and this initial goal of CFSP, CSDP reaching fruition. A transactional period ensues 2006 to 2016, I think, sparked by the failure of the constitutional treaty. But still, things pick up and they break through even during these times when it seems pessimistic. Crises spark a surge in pro-EU sentiment at the societal level. And from the period 2016 to today, I think it is more of a transformational period with what's changing in the global strategy and defense union. On the economic side, in reaction, especially to the coronavirus pandemic, the EU has started acting more like a federal state with the increased ability to borrow, tax, and spend, issuing of common debt, fiscal burden sharing, and so on. The societal level support shows Europeans are optimistic about the future of the EU. Support for the euro is consistently high. The pro-federalist groups are playing an influential role in sort of fighting the backlash of the right-wing populist sentiment, with the Pulse of Europe emerging across 130 cities, the Spinelli Group continuing along with well over 7,000 members, the Union of European Federalists. So that kind of brings me to wrapping up the European case and just sort of coming back to this idea of, I was trying to think, is this process, this optimistic kind of transformation unique to Europe, or can we see parallels of this in other cases? And indeed, I have found, especially in the space exploration case, which has been most of my work, in addition to Europe, that there is a parallel in all of that. So you can see the idea fundamentally shaping the nature of the institutions and the policy breakthroughs, galvanizing support, being framed in transformational, bold, visionary, ultrasocial ways, and opinion leaders carrying it forward. So it's not that these ideas are executed all at once. They often have two steps forward, one step back. They go in waves where sometimes there's big change and sometimes it's more transactional. But I think using the ultrasocial lens opens up our ability to kind of see these ideas continuing along and not just looking at sort of the outward manifestation of policy and what leaders are arguing at any given time. So that's kind of what I conclude, that, you know, the aim here is to hopefully open up the field of inquiry, allowing implicit assumptions about human nature to be brought to the surface. So it's not that I'm saying, like, let's pay attention to human nature and no one else is doing it. Realists are essentially assuming human nature rather than sort of examining whether those assumptions are kind of biologically correct or evolutionarily correct. And so I think, you know, this could be a valuable move. There are multiple ways to theorize it. And if we don't, there's also the danger in self-fulfilling prophecies if we continue to focus on kind of negative things and the way things go wrong and assuming that people, you know, are not sort of predisposed to have empathy toward one another. So with that, I will end. Thank you so much for listening. It's a bit of a hard project to distill into a quick presentation, but I welcome any thoughts and especially Anna's commentary as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mai'a. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen. And let's go directly into Anna's comments. It's particularly challenging to comment on such a broad project, especially if you haven't been able to read the manuscript in advance. So thanks for taking it on.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and for allowing me to discuss and to engage with Maia's work. It's always a pleasure to read her work and to especially to comment on it today. Yeah, it is a challenging project, and I really commend Mai'a for taking it on this task, which is a huge challenge, as I see it. In her book, she presents a more optimistic, yet evidence-based account of international relations, which I believe we all ought to read in the current context. I, for one, slept much better after reading some of the sample chapters that she sent around. So I read the introduction and also the chapter where she presents her framework and all the kind of the different insights that she explained at the beginning of her presentation, and then the chapter where she discusses specifically the case of European integration. And I think some of the really interesting things from this project is particularly this truly interdisciplinary approach to international cooperation. So she draws on new insights, not just from the social sciences, as others have done in the past, but also in the natural sciences, including the latest findings from neuroscience, evolutionary sociology and evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology. I mean, it is you know, amazing how she does that, also building up from the little insights to broader insights. And she draws on this cutting edge research to argue that we are actually pre-wired, as she argues, hardwired and soft-wired to be empathic, cooperative, and socially oriented. And I think she's right to argue that for a discipline such as international relations, which is so deeply concerned with cooperation and conflict, there has been very limited engagement with this recent empirical evidence that demonstrates that humans are an ultrasocial species. And I think this critical insight also applies to European studies, of course. And the four cases, the four revolutions of ultrasociality that she discusses, particularly apt to illustrate the potential of this approach. And I, for one, I'm looking forward to reading also the one on space exploration, which I didn't have a chance to read, but also given the current context, the one on nuclear weapons. I think that's going to be a really interesting one too. This one that she's discussed here today, the chapter on the EU and the federalist idea, does a superb job at unearthing the origins of the European integration project and how, rather than being a story of the failure of this federalist idea, it has continued to inspire and influence the European project over time. as I said, I haven't had a chance to read the whole book, so I guess some of the answers to my questions will be there. But I was just wondering if perhaps Mai'a could expand on a few things also, given that obviously 30 minutes is only a very limited amount of time for her to go through all the really interesting things that she discusses in her book. So I guess firstly, the book emphasizes our natural impulse for cooperation. The fact, as Mai'a puts it, that we are wired for cooperation, though she's also right to steer clear of biological determinism. But I wonder why, to what extent is this understanding of human nature incompatible with one that acknowledges that we are also driven by individual self-interest? I guess, kind of emphasizing too much this kind of ultrasociality also kind of undermines this idea that we're also driven by self-interest. And after all, individualism, as you also mentioned in the book, is one of the bases of ultrasociality. So one needs this awareness of oneself to be able to empathize with others. So my question is, are ultrasociality and self-interest mutually exclusive, or to what extent they are? Is it possible to see cooperation resulting both from self-interest and altruism? For instance, where cooperation is based on diffuse reciprocity, is that not also evidence of our ultrasocial nature? Secondly, I think it is undeniable that humans are social animals and that sociality plays a role in fostering cooperation. But I guess the key thing here is not whether cooperation happens, but under what conditions it does, and under what conditions tribalism, which you also discuss in a lot of detail in the first part of the book, might win the day. So in this regard, you identify some factors such as crisis, what some people have referred to as critical junctures, effective leadership, and a strong social movement. But the same factors might explain the rise or the triumph of tribalist ideas. So when is a crisis enabling ultrasocial ideas, and when is it enabling tribalist or antisocial idea? I guess that I think I'm missing a bit more kind of detail as to what matters in a particular context that we might find ourselves in a context where ultrasocial ideas are more relevant than tribalist, or in this, for example, in the current context, populist ideas. So, for example, regarding the example that you discussed today, the example of European integration, the federal Europe idea and the birth of the European integration project, why did they become influential in the 20th century and not before, given that the roots of the federalist movement can be traced back to the 17th century? And I would argue that the social movement behind these federal ideas was even stronger then than it was perhaps in the 50s or the 60s. So why after, for example, the Second World War, but not after World War I? So what happened? Why do we explain this? Especially given that, after all, this federalist idea was also espoused by the so-called interwar idealists at the time. And why do we see these forms of cooperation emerging in Europe, but not elsewhere, given that obviously the Second World War had an impact not just on Europe? Linked to this kind of last point, I wonder how Western-centric or Eurocentric are these explanations, or at least the cases that you look at. For instance, given the push for decolonization in the Global South at the end of the Second World War, where ideas of a world federation or a regional federation are also shared by people beyond the West. The same goes for other cases covered in the book. Are these also examples to Western-centric? And I'm just thinking some of the kind of the leaders that you, I haven't read those, but looking at the leaders that you identify there, they seem to me to come mostly from the West. Thirdly, or whichever point I am now on, to what extent is this a story of ultrasociality per se, or is it a story of ultrasocial ideas? And if this is the case, how is this different from the existing scholarship, including in constructivist literature, that has emphasized the power of ideas in international relations? I think in the introduction, you seem to dismiss constructivist and critical IR theory very quickly, but obviously they also espouse many of the assumptions of ultrasociality that you rely on. For example, the fact that humans can be altruistic, that cooperation doesn't have to be self-interested, and also this, as I said before, this role of ideas. So, I guess I want to know a little bit more how this approach is different and why a constructivist approach to ideas would not have sufficed to explore the cases that you're looking at. And then just kind of two final points. What would you say to those that might label this approach to cooperation as idealist in the same way as other label the interwar scholarship as idealist or utopian? And also, I guess that lots of people have asked you this question already, and you will be considering this for the conclusion. What does the war in Ukraine tells us about ultrasociality and its limits? So I guess a little bit more on that. And if I can, a couple just of questions about the case of Europe and the federal idea. First of all, I was wondering if you have some data about this social movement and how strong it is over time, or has been over time. And I wonder whether is this a truly social movement or whether it is more a kind of elite-driven movement. I think when I have encountered, people from this movement and I participated in the movement, seemed to me it was very kind of, about perhaps just the nature of the movement today. It's been very kind of elite, educated movement. So to what extent is this going beyond those kind of more educated and elite circles than, that we might expect, and how it has changed over time? Also, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about the federal idea and this kind of integration dilemma that you put that forward, that, transformational ideas have, they have the power to inspire, but have generally struggled to succeed. So when it comes to European integration, it has been the transactional ideas that have found more success in practice, this kind of functionalist approach to European integration. So therefore, the EU finds itself, and I guess in other cases we might find the same problem, that, yes, transformational ideas inspire, but they don't succeed, and the transactional ideas succeed, but they don't inspire. So how do we move forward from this kind of conundrum that you find in the case of European integration? And then finally, I was wondering, when you're discussing the power of ideas, to what extent is the case of European integration really a story of the power of ideas or the power of institutions? Because you also argue that it is because those institutions were in place and the founding fathers considered those institutions to be essential in order to maintain the resilience of the project over time, that we find ourselves where we find ourselves today. So I'm wondering whether, this resilience of the federalist movement and the federalist idea, it has to do with the institutions or with the idea itself. Sorry, a lot of questions, but it's really interesting. I just recommend to anyone, once it's out there, just to read it, because it is just inspiring, both the kind of the discussion, the interdisciplinary discussion of ultrasociality, but also the detailed case studies is really, really interesting.
Oh, thanks, Ana. I think that Mai'a would need not one, but several more lectures to respond to all of your questions. So Mai'a, what I suggest you can't possibly answer all of Ana's questions. Maybe you'll be able to come back to some of them. What I suggest is maybe you just pick one or two of the big theoretical questions and one or two of the questions about the EU, and then we can open up to the audience. I also have a question that I will kick us off with. So go ahead, Mai'a.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ana. I mean, it's amazing that you read so much of the book manuscript. I really appreciate it. And the questions and comments, every single one of them, are extremely valuable. So as I work on revising and submitting the full manuscript, I will definitely be incorporating all of this. I really appreciate it. So I guess if I'm choosing some of them to address, I'm just scrolling through my notes here. I think one of the challenging ones that you rose as a question is the self-interest and altruism coexisting. So I'm going to leave that aside and think about that further, because I think it's important and I should kind of grapple with that, how they can both sort of exist. I mean, I'm still going to argue that, because I'm at a broader scale, that I'm really trying to stay away from individuals and what they're saying, because that gets too biologically deterministic. So I'm trying to look at the grander trajectory of what society tends to do. But I think, the question of why constructivism is not enough is one that I would like to answer, because, as you know, all of my work is constructivist. So when I started doing this interdisciplinary research, I had to really kind of think about, what am I saying here? And I don't think it's incompatible with constructivism. But what I do think is that constructivism is a little bit too open on the side of humans being a blank slate. That is kind of what drew me to constructivism in the first place, in that, obviously we are socialized, we learn norms, we change norms, human agency is incredibly important. But it tends to assume that we as humans emerge on the scene more or less as a blank slate, and then we get socialized into what is pre-existing in society, what the norms are. Certain ones of us decide to push back and change things. But actually, I think it's more helpful, especially if constructivism is going up against some of the other IR theories, to acknowledge that, maybe we're not completely a blank slate, because some of the other approaches also, they have built-in assumptions about our starting point. So I think constructivism is strengthened by this ultrasocial ontology, because it actually says that, we are predisposed to certain kinds of ideas and norms. And I think that's already coming through in the literature. But then the realists look at that literature and criticize it for making assumptions out of nowhere, when actually this ultrasocial ontology can ground those assumptions of constructivism and build from there. So it's not, a mystery as to why I then advance an ideational argument, which is thoroughly constructivist, because I think it is actually most compatible with the ultrasocial ontology. And as far as your point about critical IR theory, on my list is to add in more of that. It was something the reviewers brought up as well. I do think that they espouse some of these ideas, and so it's important to kind of give that credit. But what has disturbed me is that these approaches are so sidelined in the major fields, especially feminist IR. And I think they can also be strengthened by saying, hey, look, we have this kind of very concrete, scientifically proven basis for what we're saying. We're not simply pointing out kind of humans are altruistic and so on, but there is this rich, deep kind of literature emerging in other fields that supports that. So I think that is actually helpful. And then in the case of Europe and what does the war in Ukraine tell us about ultrasociality and its limits? So just kind of something I don't address in the manuscript yet. I think that, mapping it onto the framework, we're seeing in Putin, of course, a kind of tribalist, malevolent leader who is trying to very blatantly, put across incorrect information domestically to stay in charge and to kind of rile up and radicalize the domestic population in Russia to keep that power. So he is taking advantage of it in a kind of classic tribalistic way, which you could then say, look, the world is not ultrasocial. But I think, again, that the framework actually includes elements of this, because he is using essentially ultrasocial language in a twisted way to justify the invasion by saying that, Ukrainian people are part of us in Russia, and that was always supposed to be we are. So he's saying it's about a common society, but ultimately being about us versus them. And then the reaction of the world, to me, is a classic example of a crisis sparking the quote unquote impossible, reaction. The liberal international order seemingly rejuvenating a whole bunch of countries with very different perspectives, speaking with one voice against what Russia has done. Boundaries to integration falling on the wayside in the defense and security realm for Europe. So I think it's actually a great example that illustrates kind of this framework I'm trying to build. And I definitely, take your point about ideas, institutions, and the conundrum about transactional versus transformational ideas in the European integration project. So how I see this is that really, it's this initial surge, and that's why I spend more time in the book manuscript on the origins of federalism. And I'll definitely take your suggestion of addressing further back in time to the interwar period. But it's that societal push that changes a worldview more generally and becomes accepted. Something that's so hard to kind of track in international relations, that kind of ideational change. But that doesn't mean that, transactional ideas then don't matter or they're less important. The transactional ideas I see as kind of the follow through of the transformational idea. So you have this big shift in worldview. And then, of course, you need governments and political actors and policy elites and epistemic communities to translate that worldview ideational shift into smaller, decisions that ultimately allow the bigger transformation to take place. But what I've argued across all of the cases is that you need these ideas that are really so powerfully transformative that they are impossible at the time. They're aspirational. The EU in the global strategy even uses the word aspiration. All of these EU major statements, for the most part, the big ones, are aspirational. They can't be done immediately. But in the wake of them and the agreement around them, you then get these like smaller steps to execute them. So I think the aspiration, the bigger transformations, they're not failing. They're opening up the pathway forward to make this idea possible. So an analogy to the space case is there was actually a plan for a joint Soviet-US moon landing. That was the plan. Totally aspirational, right? Like, oh my God, how can this happen? I thought there was a space race going on here. But it was actually an official bipartisan policy to pursue a joint moon landing. And then, obviously, as they work through some of the sort of concerns about sharing technology and so on, they decide it's too much now. Let's not pursue that. But a whole host of other cooperative agreements with the Soviet Union on a smaller scale were agreed to, I think, because the more transformational, crazy, passionate idea was expressed in a way and taken seriously to some degree. And then ultimately you have Russian-US cooperation with the International Space Station. So these ideas are not failing. They are paving the way for the smaller transactions to occur. So I'll stop there since I have so many questions from you, but all very excellent. I really appreciate your time reading it.
Thanks, Mai'a. It's good to hear these elaborations. The question I want to kick off with is one which I think many, if not most, EU scholars will have in mind. You've probably been asked it on many occasions already, which is how do you go about establishing the causal significance of the ideational currents you're studying, such as the European Federalist movement, and how do you show that focusing on them, produces an empirically more convincing account of the evolution of European integration than competing approaches, whether it be intergovernmentalism or neo-functionalism or indeed post-functionalism. So, as I was listening to you, I thought of, among others, Alan Milward and his students. The European rescue of the nation state. And if you read that book, which obviously is, a very, I mean, it has its assumptions and theoretical framework, but it's a deeply empirical, archival book. What it basically tells you in the preface is that the motivation for it was the irritation that he and his students felt for the kind of early historical accounts of European integration, which were very centered around these federalist movements, whose actual, practical significance he thought were very exaggerated. And when you were talking about the 1948 Hague Conference, I was reminded of this book by the French scholar Robert Salé called Le Viol d'Europe, enquête sur la disparition d'une idée. Now, this is a book that was written in 2013. I actually don't agree with very much in it, but he uses the 48 Hague Conference as like an account of the possibilities of European cooperation. He's writing, he's a socially oriented economist. He's writing during the Euro crisis. It's, like many books written at that time, is a book of great disappointment and disillusionment with what he thought the EU had become. And so the question is really, how do you demonstrate that your account is better and more convincing than those of someone like Alan Millward on the one hand, or Robert Salé on the other? And I'll stop there and give you a chance to answer. Meanwhile, people can be thinking, maybe you can turn on your cameras, and those who want to intervene, you can put up your virtual hands in the participants list, and I will see you. Or you can also put up your physical hands if your camera is on. So Mai'a.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I guess I have a multi-part answer. I mean, some of this is that the main point of the book is less to kind of test theory and advance a very structured causal argument, and more about introducing this kind of new starting point for international relations and revealing that in multiple case studies we can see the importance of these ideas at work that are sparked from an ultrasocial predisposition. From there, you can take the arguments in many different directions, and I think the goal of kind of explaining why European federalism sort of succeeds or not could be explained in different ways. But the sort of body of literature that exists now, I find neo-functionalism, intergovernmentalism, supranationalism, multi-level government, all of that stuff tends to be focused on like specific periods of time, trying to kind of chase the specific developments in a kind of moment in time, or a kind of like contained period in which there were certain interests at work and certain contextual challenges, certain phases of integration. But what I miss more is something that can kind of give us an overarching trajectory of where European integration is going. And to me, if I were to really back up and say, what does all of this mean? Because obviously all of my other scholarship is very focused on like each causal step, alternate arguments, why this matters and not that. But if we back way up, what I see there is this march towards more and more integration in Europe, and that always in the discussions about how to go forward and whether to go forward is the federalist idea at multiple levels of society, within the federalist organizations, within groups that the members of the European Parliament belong to. So these other theories can be useful at particular moments to explain, why the transactional idea resulted in this policy and not that policy, or why, the common security and defense policy took this form and not that form. But and so in that sense, they're useful and they're potentially compatible. They're looking at causal beliefs to the extent that they care about ideas. But if we want to then zoom out and understand the whole thing, and I think it's incredibly important to point this out because we're in a group of Europeanists right now. But when you kind of engage with anybody outside of our scholarly group and network, the misperceptions about the nature of Europe and EU integration are astounding. I was a member for 5 years of the Council on Foreign Relations in the US, based in New York. People who are like elite policymakers, not understanding the first thing about Europe. They basically see it as this thing of the past that the EU has failed, it can never succeed. All of these sweeping claims that, you know, are mind-boggling. So in a sense, I'm trying to target that and to at least correct the overall picture of what this means and where Europe fits and EU integration fits in international relations, rather than kind of the causal specific steps. I do think there's a causal element to what I'm arguing, which is that this idea is important. We could go further and say, but how important is it compared to X, Y, and Z? But in the grand overarching trajectory of EU integration, I think this idea sort of trumps other ideas in getting us to this continual path toward more and more integration, towards more and more federalism. And the other things, they could be setbacks, they could be sort of like sidebars, like Brexit. You know, there's various things that occur. They may be useful to understand with more mid-range classic theorizing. But that would be my answer there. The book is targeted at a more general audience, and so that is kind of the goal, and hopefully that readers beyond our kind of Europeanist group can actually see the story of the EU as a success story, because they very much do not. To see it as a success story and to see it lined up against other things like the nuclear weapons taboo, like international cooperation in space, I think there's a valuable sort of angle there.
Thanks, Mai'a. I would have a comeback, but I want to open up the discussion. Can I see whether there's anybody who would like to ask a question to Mai'a? I don't see people putting up their hands or even turning on their cameras in the Zoom. I mean, Natalie, do you want to come into the discussion at all? Well, maybe I then will just come back with one comment and also ask Ana if she wants to comment on the exchange, and then we'll wrap up. And that is, so, I mean, one, I agree with you that the EU is widely misunderstood, including in the United States in the kind of circles, or maybe even especially in the United States in the kind of circles you're talking about. But not only because arguably the EU is much more successful and it's given credit for, but because people think of it in as a federalist superstate, and then they will say, well, that's not really what we see, or isn't that a problematic kind of vision? So, you know, for me, one of the federal idea is a problem for understanding how the EU is governed today and why it works, which I think it is, without being intergovernmental, it is also much less supranational than classic federalism would assume. So, I mean, I'd have to read the chapter, but I wonder how helpful it is to try to say, okay, the forward steps that we see in integration are actually the validation of the ideas of the Federalist movement from the 1940s onwards.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, that, you know, in effect, by kind of focusing on the grand aspiration of what this United States of Europe could be, it kind of also forces this emphasis on how the EU falls short of that. And that is, you're right, I completely agree, a source of a lot of like disgruntlement with the EU and perceptions that somehow it should be this ideal, and yet it clearly isn't. Why isn't the EU speaking with one voice at every single possible foreign policy juncture, and so on? So I think, this can only be something that is explained with nuance. And I would come back again to this argument that it is only with aspiration, with ideas that kind of stir up momentum among society and and interest from society, that you can even get to a point where the EU might look more like a federalist superstate or look more successful in that respect. I don't think that it necessarily has to get there. I think it's, at a fine point of integration right now. But the fact of the matter is that having the aspiration to do more is part of what inspires people to think that, the EU is this groundbreaking political organization that has more ahead of it, and who knows where it might end up. So it's a relatively young actor as far as comparing it to other federal states, for example. I think we can't put too much onto it in terms of what it has done so far. But the falling short is actually the silver lining. I mean, it is the thing that then allows more aspiration to go further. And there are parallels across the board in the cases. The space case is the same way, right? Why haven't humans arrived at Mars yet? I mean, people have been talking about moon and onto Mars for decades, right? But it's the aspiration of knowing that, we are just going to say we are going to Mars by the 1930s or 2030s that inspire many, many people to go into science, to work on rocketry, to advance the commercial side along with the public side of space exploration. So you could look at it as a failure, that when was the last time humans were on the moon in the 70s? But you could also look at it as the spark for more, which right now is very much in place with Artemis and other initiatives. So
we have a question from a member of the audience, Nikola Petrovich. Nikola, could you identify yourself just briefly first and then pose your question?
I'm Nikola Petrovich. I'm working at the Institute for Social Research in Zagreb, in Croatia. And I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I'm interested in the question of political parties. Do you deal with them, or do you deal only with federal movements, social movements? I'm thinking about Christian democratic parties or socialists who went through ideological transformations and became pro-European, or maybe new pro-European parties like Volt or DiEM25. What is your take on them, and how do they come into this picture of ultrasociality? Because in a way they compete with each other on a national level, and sometimes they cooperate on supranational level. But I'm interested to hear your opinion. What is the role of competition, political competition, in this ultrasociality and the influence on the future of European project?
Great, thank you. Yeah, that is a great question. And one of the suggestions that I'm implementing from reviewers is kind of bringing in governments more into the analysis. And so I'm really glad that you articulated that question. I do have some elements of political parties coming in through the historical account in terms of how they participated in the various federalist movements. And of course, the European Parliament has very concrete membership through Spinelli Group and Crocodile Club and others. But through national European parties, representatives of these parties have participated in, for example, the Council of Europe and other groups, and they've had an important voice as kind of representatives of their constituents and society at large. The ideological transformations in some of these parties that you've pointed out, I think that's really valuable to analyze, and something that I have not focused on in the manuscript just for trying to cover such a big span of time and so many activities. But it's a good suggestion to bring in, because they essentially, by looking at the debates in political parties, we can have an indicator of, what people are talking about more generally in society and whether ultrasocial ideas are key in all of this. So there are, of course, many political parties throughout the EU that kind of run on platforms that involve the EU. It used to be in the past that political parties could more or less kind of set aside debates about the EU and focus more on domestic politics because the EU was just too removed. But I think we're seeing, even looking at, the French election coming up in 3 days, much more of this need to focus on how do you see the EU, your membership in it, what should your country be contributing or not contributing, and changes that involve more pro-Europe, more federal emphasis versus not. In just a small example, like looking at Marine Le Pen and how in the past she blatantly was saying that she would take France out of the EU in a Brexit kind of situation, and she's fallen away from that argument because it's just it harms her popularity to be so extreme. So you can take indications like that to understand what is the sort of tone and tenor of the debate at the societal level. How do people see this beyond opinion polls and so on? How do people see their future in Europe? And does this really force leaders into particular boxes? Because as I've argued, leaders are just the reflection of societal desires. Leaders don't exist without followers pushing them forward and then empowering them to express these opinions. So I think through political parties, we see this kind of mid-level debate on what Europe is and whether to what extent ultrasocial predispositions are stronger or weaker. The fact that so many, a few years ago, especially, so many political parties, extreme right, extreme left, and some, of course, continue to be supported today, have emerged, that does kind of give you a chance to then examine, but how successful actually are they? Ultimately, do they get beaten back by those who would prefer a more ultrasocial approach, because these parties are more tribal? The far right and the far left, but especially the far right, tend to be very tribal, us versus them. They are those examples, not unlike Putin, not unlike Trump, that are championing these ideas that go against ultrasociality. So do they ultimately win or not? I think they don't. And so I think the political parties are a good barometer for that kind of ideational debate and transformation.
Thanks. Ana, do you have any last words you want to offer?
No, I think I'm going back to the last question that you posed. I think that's a really interesting question. I think when I was talking about this conundrum between transformational and transactional ideas or projects, that I think that's also partly related to that, in that, the failure or the lack of success of those transformational ideas on the one hand, so the lack of success of this federal project means that kind of the EU might inspire less kind of the general population, while what we see in practice has been the success of the most transactional ideas, which tend to be less inspirational. But yeah, so I think that kind of conundrum and how the EU deals with it is particularly relevant there. I think also one of the other paradoxes of the European project is that as it becomes more like a federation, or in this case, like a state, then we might also wonder to what extent this also challenges this ultra-social idea of, a world of states, with the EU having now military power, the possibility of getting involved in conflicts, whether that's also actually going to challenge some of the kind of the ultra-social idea that was behind this idea of Europe as a federation, kind of the starting idea. So I was wondering whether Mai'a had anything else to say about that.
All right, so Mai'a will give you the last word, and then we need to close that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, these questions are all so thought-provoking in my huge, challenging project that I've taken on. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, I think, it is, of course, important to ask whether if the EU actually achieves what it sets out to do, which is to become more or less like a state. And we're seeing now that there's this serious emphasis on military power in reaction to Russia. What does that mean in terms of the sort of idealism and sort of altruism and the ultra-social emphasis that I think is so infused in earlier periods of the EU? So, of course, we can't predict the future. I would say that if we look at, again, the narratives, which I think are so important as an indicator of where things are going, the narratives of the meaning of Europe, and this happened very, very visibly in the first few days of the Russian invasion. Various leaders, von der Leyen and others, and when Zelensky went to various national parliaments throughout Europe, the narrative comes out of the meaning of Europe, the meaning of what Europeans stand for, how they react to this, horrible violation of the core norms of what Europe stands for, and the violation of, all these years of peace that is sort of the hallmark of European achievement. I think those narratives are quite revealing when it comes to showing that, so far, the European project is holding very tightly to those original ideals. This is why the barriers to so many things that have been sticking points in the past have fallen away in order to react to Russia. Looking at, very early on, the German willingness to get rid of Nord Stream 2, when this was so super controversial for all these years, and in the first days of the battle, being willing to put a halt to that, and why that is the case. So I don't think we can just kind of look at the trappings superficially of state and the type of actor the EU is, but really the underlying ideas that shine through in terms of the narrative, and then what society is calling for, right? Society welcoming Ukrainian refugees in and sort of becoming more politicized in reaction to something happening just next door that violates so much of what Europe stands for. So it's not pure success. I mean, I don't want to come across as utopian by any means, but to be grounded in the evidence. Of course, Orban got reelected. So there's always controversies here. There's always this tug of war between more tribal ideas and ultra-social ideas. But what I think this interdisciplinary literature ultimately enables us to do is to recognize when the ultra-social side, which can help cooperation, is really at work, and not to kind of jump to conclusions about conflict being sort of the nature of what international relations is all about. So I think I'll end on that note because there's just so much to say, but I thank you for the opportunity here to talk about this work.